afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this month's MSP-Ignite webinar. This month's webinar will be a bit different than most. For one thing, our sponsor and content provider are one and the same. But don't worry, that does not mean you're going to get a sales pitch for the next hour. As a matter of fact, our friends at IT Pro TV simply wanted to provide an example of the types of training that they have available by sharing some Azure training. They also have a surprise offering for all attendees at the end, so don't leave early and miss out. Before I introduce our speakers, let's go over some of the logistics and ground rules. As always, we are recording this session, and we will send you an email after this webinar with a copy of the slides and a link to the MSP-Ignite YouTube channel, where you will be able to watch this presentation and our previous presentations. Now, you'll all remain muted during the presentation. However, we do encourage questions, so please use the Q&A button to ask questions along the way. We'll try and remind you as we go. Our speakers today are Mike Rodrick and Adam Gordon. Mike has more than 15 years of IT instruction experience, including 10 as a Microsoft certified trainer. Mike became an IT Pro edutainer in 2014. Adam has 30 plus years as an IT instructor in the private and public sectors. He holds more than 160 IT certifications. He has trained thousands of IT pros over the course of his career. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, everybody.
It's all yours.
All right, well, let's do it, Adam. Here to talk about some Azure Virtual Desktop, right?
Sure. That or how to make the perfect cup of espresso. But
Yeah.
I think probably we should start with AVD.
All right, sounds good to me.
So, Mike, it's good to be able to spend some time with you, and hopefully with all of the people attending from MSP-Ignite. We're going to get to show you some really cool stuff. Mike and I are going to talk a bit about what Azure Virtual Desktop is. Don't worry, we're not going to bore you too much with the details. We're going to show you a lot of really cool stuff about how you can put this technology to work, but we got to spend a little bit of time giving you the broad sense of what AVD can do in case you're not familiar with it. And that's where we're going to begin. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to spend a few minutes just going over some of the highlights with you about what Azure Virtual Desktop is, what it can do for you, for your customers, for your business, and how you can position it in order to be able to provide services that today may not be easily accessible, may not be easily manageable, and most importantly, easily scalable from one single source of truth, one common pane for administration, management, and deployment. And when we get done talking about the overview, Mike's going to take us on a guided tour and show us some really interesting things we can do with the technology. So, Mike, if we can jump in, start to take a look at our first slide, talk a bit about what does Azure Virtual Desktop let us do, how does it do that, then we can go ahead and we can get to the demonstration.
Yep, I've got the slides pulled up. There we go. All right, well, Adam, why don't you lead us off talking about, what does Azure Virtual Desktop let us do?
So when we think about Azure Virtual Desktop, what we're really thinking about is the ability to do something we have historically probably all done, or at least wished we could have done, but perhaps a little bit easier, going all the way back, actually, believe it or not, to Windows NT 4, some of the earliest network-capable operating systems that all of us, or at least many of us, have probably had experience with and used over the last 25 or so years. Microsoft's been in this business. When you go all the way back to NT 4 and we start moving forward up through Windows 2000, 2003, 2008, certainly 2012, 2016, and now 2019 and Server 2022, we have the ability to use one or more forms of remote desktop and use that capability to serve up applications and provide remote services. But the problem is we had to have fixed assets running typically in our own data centers. We had to own, rack, and stack and scale our own infrastructure. And we usually were doing so with a limited set of application offerings and a mixture of perhaps standardized from our perspective desktops, but the reality is a mixture of different desktops that were not managed, but really just providing basic services. What Azure Virtual Desktop lets us do first and foremost is change the way we provide desktop and application access for users. We set up multi-session Windows 10 based deployments, and we can deliver what most of us would think of as a full Windows 10 user experience, but it's fully scalable. It is licensed, configured, controlled by us through the single pane of glass I was talking about through the Azure, the infrastructure provided through the Azure Fabric up in the Microsoft data centers. And we can virtualize our Microsoft 365 app workloads. So our capabilities to be able to use Outlook, PowerPoint, Excel, any of those apps are going to be part of that solution and run them in this multi-user virtualized environment. but we also can reach backwards in time, because I'm sure one or more of you are probably still struggling with how to support Windows 7. And the reality is, while it should have probably gone away by now, I have a lot of customers out there that are still running Windows 7 for a variety of reasons. I know Mike has experience dealing with this in the real world with some of the people he talks to, and we both train on a regular basis. And the reality is, while it's a very great and stable operating system for decades gone by, it really is a bit of a struggle to run it securely today. And what Microsoft has done, which I think is a really smart positioning and a success point for them with regards to AVD, is support Windows 7 in a virtual desktop environment, but provide the extended security updates we need in order to run it securely, still allow it to be productive for us while we have those backwards compatibility needs that many of us are probably struggling to in some way or another, ultimately survive, surface, and ultimately then service across the organization, but do so in a secure way. So Mike, we like the idea that we can look ahead to Windows 10, and ultimately, I know you'll touch on this as you begin to discuss some of the demonstration capabilities, but ultimately Windows 11, right? Looking ahead going forward at some point, even though right now we're focusing on Windows 10. But I like the fact we can look backwards to Windows 7 and run a mixture of these operating systems securely if necessary. Any thoughts about that before we move on?
One, I think it's great that Microsoft did that, because we know there are some people that are running applications that still require that Windows 7. They never updated it. And this is really the only place that you can get, right, those updates, those security enhancements to Windows 7. So if you're running Windows 7 for any reason, you should definitely be using Azure Virtual Desktop. And then the whole multi-session, right? Windows 10 multi-session, allowing multiple users to access the same Windows 10 VM, just allows me to scale, to use my money a little better, to make more efficient use of those VMs. And this is the only place you can get that as well. So really, those are two very compelling reasons to be getting into Azure Virtual Desktop. And then I love your comparison. We remember the remote desktop services days, right? And trying to run this in-house and configure terminal services and deploy apps and use AppV. And this is really taking all of that technology, putting it out there in Azure and making it super simple. I mean, once you see these demonstrations, you're like, wow, they have really streamlined this. It is a very impressive product.
It is, and I do remember the pain as well as the frustration associated with those deployments. So let's take a look at an additional set of capabilities, right, that we can continue to think about when we think about what else we can do. Bringing that RDS environment, as we were talking about, those remote desktop service solutions, and those desktops in, managing them and converting them into the seamless experience is what we're thinking about. We're scaling massively, but we're also providing a common front end that allows users to access these services without having to worry about where they log in, how they get to it. Is the gateway going to be available? Is the right amount of, or are the right amount of resources being provided through that server? Have we maxed out our connections? Right? None of those things are going to matter anymore, because all of that's being managed on the back end through our host pools and the massive scalability that we're going to be able to see and talk about as we get into the demonstration. We virtualize both the desktop as well as the app workloads running on it, so a full virtualization solution. And as a result, it is highly scalable. But as a result of being virtualized, it's also going to be able to be managed, it's going to be monitored, and it's going to ultimately be more stable. But we also have the ability to persist that experience for the user, right? So they can get that same desktop, that same app workload over time, and it's portable on the back end. Although we're not going to touch so much on that today, the reality is Microsoft can move those images around for us and can manage them at scale in their data center fabric, and we don't have to worry about maintaining ownership and management. Read that as responsibility for the entire technology experience. We really just focus on the provisioning that allows us to give those apps and that desktop solution to those front-end users. We already talked about Windows 10, Windows Server, and or Windows 7 desktops and that unified solution. So this is what Azure Virtual Desktop does. But let's also think about not only what it does, but how it works. And you've heard us talk a little bit about the fact we're essentially taking all those technology stack experiences we've had over the years, condensing them, and really reimagining them as we think about what AVD does. Mike talked a little bit about the idea of AppV, one of the early forays Microsoft had into application virtualization. And for those of you that may have used AppV over that period of time it was available, or may even have used competitive products, right? We're not allowed to talk about competitors when we talk about individual stack solutions. I'm kidding. We can talk about things like Citrix, and many of you probably know about and might have even used Zen Desktop, Zen App, and those competitive solutions. And Microsoft was always running to catch up in that space. And that was the story for a long time. Citrix was that thought leader and really that solution that set the bar, right? In the virtualization space, it was VMware for a long time, and Microsoft was running to catch up there. But the reality of the story today is that it's very different, right? VMware and Citrix are still both competitors, still offer great solutions. But the reality is today, Microsoft's integrated that entire stack end to end and offers a full-featured solution, allowing us to virtualize those desktop environments, but we do so without running any gateway services. We don't have to run gateway servers. Those RDS pools go away. We don't have to rack and stack and own that infrastructure, right, sitting behind us in our data center. We now focus on provisioning host pools. You're going to see Mike demonstrate and talk about how to do this in just a couple of minutes. And we can scale those massively to accommodate a variety of different workloads. And by the way, not just Microsoft-centric workloads. We can load third-party apps in as well and run those. So it's not just a Microsoft story today. It's a Microsoft story that really allows us to reimagine the way we work at scale. So Mike, if we can go to the next slide really quickly, thinking about how we work at scale implies the ability for us not just to pull images down and use a pre-configured set of images that Microsoft or a vendor has imagined for us. Those are good as starting points. But what you're going to see, and we'll talk about in the demonstration, is the ability for us to customize that image, creating a one-size-fits-one solution for your needs and for your customers' requirements with regards to how their users will work. You can bring your own images, you can load them up into the environment, or pull down pre-made images and start from there, or a combination of both, as you'll come to understand. And because of the massive scaling and the pooling that we're going to be talking about, you get multi-session resources, as Mike suggested, but you're able to manage cost more efficiently. That idea Mike hit on about multi-session use and connecting to a Windows 10 environment, having multiple users using resources there means you need less machines, less virtual infrastructure and virtual instances running to achieve the same end result, which translates to less dollars at the end of the day. And as I mentioned earlier, our individual ownership through personal, what we call persistent desktops, is there, meaning users maintain that state of their environment even though they're not using it consistently. Just like if they had a physical environment they're working off of, it's there when they need it, and it's going to change with them and grow with them over time, but it's always going to be present, which means we don't have to worry about resetting that environment and worrying about then repurposing it, changing it, adding things in, removing things, and maybe losing that user experience and consistency along the way. We're going to have that profile effectively, if you think of it that way, and it's going to be consistent and persistent for those user desktops, which we like a lot. So Mike, we've talked a bit about how it works at scale from the user perspective. Let's quickly talk about what goes on behind the scenes. For me, talk about this single pane of glass that we can use to provision and manage. This is the Azure Portal. And you're probably familiar with the Azure Portal at some level. I'm sure many of you are in and out of it, working with it on behalf of yourself and your customers. Mike's going to take us on a guided tour, show us a little bit more about it in depth in this area. But the Azure Portal is that traditional front-end thought process we use. Web-enabled, allows us to connect and easily through a graphical user interface, do what we need to do. But we have Azure Virtual Desktop PowerShell as well. Those of you that prefer the command line, we can go in there and do things at scale and automate along the way. And we have REST-based API interfaces that allow us to configure and do all the things we need to do from a management perspective. Mike's going to demonstrate and show us some of that in just a couple of minutes. We're able to provide full desktop or individual remote apps from that host pool, allowing us to serve individual configurations up and service multiple groups of users by segmenting them and creating what we call app groups. This allows different sets of users to be assigned and given access to different levels of application workloads, different configurations, and essentially provide multiple individualized solutions from a single common source. That alone, in terms of the scalability and the flexibility, is really, really important for us to consider. And finally, as we round out just our high-level overview of what we can look for and think about as we see the demonstrations, I want to think about the fact that we also can look at the new diagnostic services that are available, right? So when we think about diagnostic services, what I think about is how do I troubleshoot when things go wrong? when I'm supporting customers that are using AVD, and I have a lot of customers that are. I like the fact, and Microsoft recently brought out a new diagnostic service to help us troubleshoot errors. I like the fact I can do so remotely. I can get on the phone with a customer, I can log into the portal, I can take a look at what's happening, and if necessary, I can transfer that conversation over to Microsoft support easily, but I have good evidence of what's been going on. If you haven't seen the diagnostic service capabilities, definitely take a look. Coming out of Microsoft Ignite, right? Not MSP-Ignite, but Microsoft Ignite this year, recently, just in the last couple of weeks, as Microsoft finished up the latest version of Ignite going out into the end of this year, we saw some really interesting new announcements on the direction Azure Virtual Desktop is taking, and the Diagnostic Service and the updates to it was one of those. And we're allowed to manage and really focus on managing just the image in the virtual machines when we think about this service. Again, I don't have to worry about what goes on behind me in the data center. I really just have to focus on provisioning that experience and making sure that that front end, right, the access to the virtual desktop, the virtual machine, et cetera, that's Microsoft. I don't have to worry about that. Do I have to worry about racking and stacking? I don't have to worry about that. Do I have to worry about making sure that it's always on and available? Don't have to worry about that either. A lot of the traditional infrastructure concerns we would have providing this capability simply vanish. They're gone. Microsoft is taking care of all of that for us. What we need to do is create the best images we can, tweak, customize, nip and tuck, if you will, to create that desktop experience, and then turn our users loose and let them benefit from it. So Mike, we've set the stage, if you will, for what we're going to do and really the logic behind it. But I know you've got a couple of demos planned for us. I know you want to take us in, show us some things that are already baked, and then backfill that knowledge by showing us how we get there. So what's the best place for us to begin?
Thanks, Adam, for all that information. Great stuff there about Azure Virtual Desktop. And yeah, that's exactly right. Because as we know, this is honestly, it's really quick. When we talk about creating these host pools, we talk about, we're basically deploying virtual machines. And honestly, it's pretty quick, but our time frame for the webinar is a little short. So I have done some of the whole raw turkey in, cooked turkey coming back out, a little pre-baked stuff for us. So we get to see it all and kind of see what's going on. And I think, Adam, a good place to start is talking about the first thing we're going to end up doing is creating a host pool, right? Because the host pool is what hosts the virtual machines that the users are going to connect to. There's actually a workspace that they connect to, but the host pool is the underlying operating system, right? The VMs that are hosting the applications or the full desktop. So that's really where we start. Now, when you create your host pool, you're basically deploying virtual machines, one or more, how many hosts you need to support your workloads, right? We can talk a little bit about those algorithms, but you've got to create those VMs from something, and you really have three main choices, right? You've got the Azure Gallery images, which are your pre-built Windows installs, such as Windows 10 or Windows 11 coming out now, or that Windows 7 or Server 2019 or whatever. They have some that already have Microsoft 365 installed on them, which can be a big time saver. It's also where we're going to get those multi-session Windows 10 versions, right? This isn't an ISO you can go get anywhere. This is the only place you can get that. So you're going to browse to that gallery. So that's one place you can get an image to create your VMs for your host pool. But it's going to be whatever Microsoft built, right? It's their installation of Windows 10 with maybe the Microsoft 365 apps on there, but it's a pretty standard default install. You can also upload your own VHD or VHDX. So you could take one of those images, create a VM in Microsoft or up in Azure, and then export that VHD locally, run Hyper-V locally, create a VM, install software, do your customization, and then go through the process of sysprepping, generalizing that VHD, exporting it out, uploading it back up into Azure, and then storing it up there, which is definitely a viable option. And the third option is probably the easiest one, which means just create a VM in Azure like you would any other virtual machine, right? Go into virtual machines, create a new one, deploy it, pick your gallery image of whatever you want to start with, and then just allow remote desktop into that VM, remote into it, and do your customizations. Install your line of business applications, do all of your Windows updates and your store updates, and then save that. You're going to basically capture an image of that VM in Azure and then store it in a shared image gallery. Well, we're going to change the name of that here in just a second. And then when you build your host pool, you can browse to that. And there's a lot of advantages of using what's now called an Azure Compute Gallery. You might have heard it referred to as a shared image gallery. But once you put an image up in there, this is a managed image. We can do versioning on it. We can have fault tolerance built into it. We can replicate it around the world to where it's close to wherever we're deploying our host pools at. It's definitely, I think, in my opinion, the way to go. I can create a new VM based off off that image, do updates, whatever I need to do, and then generalize it again, deploy it back out to my host pools. It's probably the easiest, I think, way to go. And that's what we're going to show you here today. So join me back on my screen as I babbled there for a little too long. I want to start with that Azure Compute Gallery. So I'm at portal.azure.com. I'm logged in with my account. I'm going to flip over to Azure Compute Galleries, as I said, previously known as shared image galleries. And you'll see that I already have one created. So I've got one here that I just happen to call AVD images. That's the gallery itself. When I go into that gallery, I'll see that I have one definition, right? This guy right here. And the definition really defines what the OS type is and some high-level information about the VMs that would be created from this image. Within that definition, let's see if we go into our versions. I'll click on that definition, and then you'll see down here I've made my first version right here. Call it 001, whatever you want to call your versioning, so you can keep track of that. This is what we're going to create that VM from. So that version of this particular VM image definition is what we end up creating. Now, when we go to create our host pools, I will browse and I will find this, and I will make those host pools based off of that. The question is, how do we get this here, right? How do we get this image into this gallery? And creating the gallery itself is really easy. If I come back out to Azure Compute Galleries and I click Create, there's not a lot to it. You're simply going to choose your resource group, give it a name, give it a description, because it's really just a library, right? There's no additional, there's tags, review and create, and that's it. So it's just a library, a place to store your images. So that would be your first step, to create that gallery. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create our VM. So this is going to become our image that we want to create these host pools with. So I'm going to go back out to my dashboard, and I'm going to go over into virtual machines. And hopefully you've done this before. You've seen how to create a VM in Azure. I don't feel like we're going to go over this whole process. There are a couple of things that I would want to point out. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create Virtual Machine. And most of this is pretty straightforward, right? Your subscription, your resource group that you're going to store that in, a name for your virtual machine. We really, it's not important. I shouldn't say it's not important, right? Make that name descriptive. That's not going to be the name of your session host, is what I was trying to say. Where you want to store that, availability options. A lot of this doesn't really matter. It's like availability options and things like that, because this is going to be generalized, sys-prepped, shut down, and put into my gallery. So I'm not typically worried about things like that. What I am worried about is this one right here. What image am I going to use to start with, right? So this is where your decision comes in. What are we doing? Notice I've got this as a recently used, but this one is the Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session 21H1, so relatively up to date, and it already has those Microsoft 365 apps. What a time saver. That means I don't have to worry about installing Office, optimizing it for multi-session, or anything like that. It's all pre-configured. Now, it is generic, right? There's none of my line of business apps. It's a default install of Windows 10 with Microsoft 365. It also means you have to have the appropriate licenses. We're not going to dive into that, but you would need to make sure that your users have the appropriate licenses to use the Microsoft 365. All right, so what I would do is I would start with this image. This is a good baseline for me. If I plan on creating a host pool where I'm going to want to deploy Office applications and maybe some line of business applications, this is a great starting point, right? I use Microsoft's image. It's already all installed. Choose your size, give yourself an administrative username and password, and then here, just allow RDP, right? Go ahead and allow remote desktop into that VM. Now, it's a security concern. We typically don't expose these VMs out to the public, so I would want to make sure this is just for while I'm setting it up, and then I would want to remove this, or I would want to make sure that I didn't leave this in a state that's open. Review and create your VM. I mean, go through the rest of the tabs, choose your disk options, your networking, your management, all of what you would normally do to create your virtual machine. All right. Now, once you've created that virtual machine, and again, to save us a little bit of time, I already have one created. All right. So this machine right here I created earlier. This is that same image, multi-session, Microsoft 365. And I left it open for remote desktop so I could get in and manage it. I'm going to connect to it via RDP. I've actually already downloaded these files, but I'll go ahead and grab it again. And I'm going to connect in. I can remember my super secret password.
Now, Mike, just while you're connecting in, The reality of connecting it early on like this is really primarily, and you mentioned it, it's for configuration. But let's be clear, it's for updating and adding patches if necessary from the image baseline, because Microsoft made that image, I don't know, days, weeks, months ago. Probably needs some patching, but also some line of business apps. I noticed you got Google Chrome and looks like Adobe Acrobat sitting on that desktop along with Teams. So it's about going in and really customizing what we want that image to look like, correct?
Yeah, exactly, right? This is your opportunity to decide what it is. You're doing this for a customer. They require apps X, Y, and Z. This is how you get those apps on those session hosts. You don't want to create your host pool, spin up 10 session hosts, and then have to go in and manage each one of those session hosts by remoting into it. One, they're not typically exposed through remote desktop. That's a security concern. We don't want to do that. And I don't want to have to do that to 10 different or 20 different or 100 different session hosts, install these applications, go through updates. So we do all that first to our image, and then we create our host pool based on that image. And then if we need to make an update to our hosts, maybe, eventually we need to run Windows updates on those session hosts, install additional applications, do whatever that is. We just take that original version of that image, create a new VM, remote desktop into it, do all of our updates and customizations, sysprep it again, create a new version, and then we can deploy that back out to our host pool and kind of round robin through the hosts and update them to that new version. So yeah, very, very important to use these, as a way to control that update process. But as Adam said, I basically created a VM using the multi-session with the Microsoft 365 apps already installed in it. And then I went ahead and installed our line of business applications, right? In this case, Google Chrome and Adobe Readers, a couple of apps that I could use just to show you that we can customize this. If I go to my start menu, I'll see that I have all the Office applications are installed there as well. Oops, and I did not mean to launch that. Misclick, let me let that start up and I'll close it out. I'll just go ahead and log off. So once you have done the customizations, you've installed your applications, you've done your Windows updates. It's not going to let me get out of there easily, is it? Yes, we're not going to send you any additional data. There we go. We'll get rid of that. All right. So once you've done all your customizations, remember, do your Windows updates. You don't want them to log into a machine and have updates pending or anything like that. Don't forget your Microsoft Store updates. We need to do those as well. Install your custom applications, update those, do your configurations, whatever the case may be. Once you've got this set up, this is your template, your golden image. Now you're going to sysprep this, right? And hopefully most of you are familiar with sysprep. If we go into, oh gosh, let's see. I'll open up PowerShell as an admin. Got a little bit of lag going on here. And let me make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to, and again, hopefully you're familiar with this. Sysprepping, it just means I'm going to strip out all that unique information, generalize this image so that it can be duplicated and not cause any conflicts. Well, if we remember that one, Adam, C:\Windows system 32 sysprep. Oops. Let's try that again. And then sysprep. You could do your options right here, sysprep.exe, switch OOBE, switch generalize, switch shutdown. Or if you just type in sysprep, you can open up the GUI version of that, right? And I'm going to come in here and I'll set this and I'll zoom in for you. Again, I want to, my Zoom tool is not working on this VM. I've entered in the OOBE. I've chosen to generalize and then shut down. And you would go through this process and you would now shut this machine down, stripping out all that unique information. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close this because I'm not going to wait for that to finish because we already have one sysprepped. So you sysprep it, you generalize it, you shut it down. Because I'm doing this all in Azure, I don't have to worry about trying to upload this VHD up into Azure, making sure it's the right format, converting it from dynamic to fixed, any of that stuff. All I have to do now is capture that image. So this VM over here, VM01, is the same VM as far as what's installed on it, but I've already sysprepped it, shut it down, and I have deallocated it. Right? Remember, shutting the Windows operating system down on an Azure VM through the Windows VM, like we just did, running sysprep, doesn't deallocate it as far as Azure is concerned. Public IP addresses are still assigned to that VM. Other resources are still committed to it. You need to deallocate it completely so that it is not being allocated any resources by clicking on the stop button up here. Oops, as I draw right through that. Click on
You want to
stop.
put an X through the stop button.
Yeah, that's what you got to do. Stop that to make sure you deallocate it. And then right next to that is the capture option, right? So once it's deallocated, now I can capture that image. So you click capture, and again, you'll see this is a very straightforward menu. There's not a lot of choices here, all right? I'm going to choose my image gallery, and what you'll notice is down here, it says no valid galleries in resource group. So switch to wherever you created that. Remember I said to create the Azure Compute Gallery first? Switch over to that resource group, and now that gallery will show up as one of your choices, all right? So you're going to change your resource group, browse over, find your gallery that you're going to, your compute gallery that you're going to store this image in. You notice I've chosen yes, share this to a gallery as a VM image version. Already says generalized, we've sysprep this. And then down below, choose your definition. So let's say I was updating it, right? I've already done this once, and so you saw version 0.0.1 listed in my gallery. Maybe it was time to do some updates or install another application, so I could choose the same definition and just make this version 0.0.2, right? Or whatever my next version was, set any replication that I wanted to set up for that, go through, do my tags, and then that's it. Review and create, and we're off to the races. So, I mean, honestly, so far, all we've done is create a VM, remote into it, and install our custom applications, sysprep it, shut it down, and capture an image of it, and store it in a gallery. That's really all we've done.
Now, Mike, just a couple of quick things probably worth noting or reminding everybody about. So deallocation, right? In your mind, in my mind, I know what it equals, but for all of you to make sure you know, it equals decreasing costs, right? Because we're paying for those private IP or those public IP addresses. We're paying for those allocated resources, even though the VM is not technically running. So you want to deallocate to ensure you drop the costs on those VMs when they're being used for image creation. And I like the fact Mike showed us that we could use tags. When I talk to customers about this, Mike showed us the importance of versioning and configuration, but we could also use tags as a metadata descriptor to identify those images so we can easily search for them and we understand what they are. So when we go to deploy them, it's easy for those administrators to do so because Mike may be creating them, but maybe I'm the one who's going to deploy them. And so if he doesn't tell me what they are, it's going to take me a lot longer to do that. So Mike, we've done the setup, right? And he tends to do that. He throws stuff out there and doesn't tell me what it is.
And I use tags like Barney and Fred, yeah.
Absolutely. We've done all the setup, but the most important thing, and the images are really important, don't get me wrong, but without a host pool, we got nowhere to actually stage them and actually deploy from. So I know the next step, at least in my mind, would be to create a host pool.
Yep.
So how do we get that started? Are you going to show us what it looks like and then backfill it again, or how are we going to deal with that?
Yep, especially with this one because when you create that host pool, as I said earlier, you're basically deploying VMs, and whatever you chose when you created that host pool, 3 session hosts, 10, whatever the case may be, right? That can take some time. So I've definitely already created one, but I want to walk you through the process and show you now that our shared image that we created, sorry, I'm going to call it a shared image for the next year, our Azure Compute Gallery image is sitting there waiting to be used for our host pool. So join me back on my screen here. I'm still out there in portal.azure.com. Now I'm going to navigate to Azure Virtual Desktop, search for it up at the top. If you don't have it pinned to your dashboard like I do, Azure Virtual Desktop will come up. And then here, we're going to click Create a Host Pool. And they've got a handy link right out here in the middle of the screen. Or you could navigate over to Host Pools and then click Create right up here. And you'll notice that I already have a host pool created that we're going to go take a peek at in just a second. But let me show you how to create one. So I'm going to click Create. It's going to start the process. And as I go through these options, I'll zoom in on a few of them so we can see them a little better. And I'm going to shrink that up to make it a little, give me a little more space. Choose your resource group where you want to deploy this host pool. Give that host pool a name. I'll call it MSP-demo or something like that. Choose your location. This is not a validation environment. Validation environments allow you to set up a host pool just for testing purposes that your users wouldn't be connecting to. I'm going to scroll down a little bit here. And then my host pool type is either going to be personal or pooled. Now, Adam mentioned this in the beginning, persistence, right? If we can set up personal desktops where that user connects to the same VM every single time. And for some of your power users, certain users, that might make sense. Most of the time, though, we're going to be going with our pooled because that's where I can take advantage of the multi-session. I can fit 10 users, their workloads that they do, on a single well-resourced VM. So I don't need to pay for 5 VMs for 5 users. I can pay for 1 VM for 5 users, giving it has enough CPU and RAM and resources to whatever their workload is. And this is what you kind of test out, try to figure out. If they're primarily office workers with office applications and things like that, they don't need a lot of resources. Once you choose pooled, you can choose your algorithm, decide how we spread the workload across the pool, the session hosts. Breadth first, meaning we spread them across. Depth first, fill up 1 VM completely with sessions before you move on to the second session host. If you choose depth first, then you would set max session limit. Like I want to go 10, that means 10 people would sit on 1 VM before I move to the second VM. If I choose breadth first, the max session limit doesn't come into play really for a while, but because we're going to spread it across those VMs equally. I'll click next. Then you get to the virtual machines, and here you're going to choose yes, right? Because obviously a host pool is not a lot of good without virtual machines in there. So we definitely want to create some. And you're going to give your machines a prefix, right? I'm going to call mine MSP. These are going to be joined to your Active Directory domain. And it will add a name to those virtual, or a -1, -2 to the end of it, but you do need a prefix for that. You also need to make sure that you can join the domain. So that's something I guess we can talk about with the networking phase here. We'll get to that in just a minute. I don't need any redundancy for this demonstration. For the source though, here's the fun part, right? I got gallery selected here, or you can see gallery, and then I can see this option to select an image, all right? Well, I'm going to hit my drop-down list, and I'll see all of those Microsoft Azure Gallery images right here, but that's not what I want. I mean, you could, right? One of your host pools could very well be just a simple Windows 10 multi-session with M365, nothing custom about it, right? So you could definitely pick one right there, and you'd be off to the races. But I want to use our shared image, the one we added those line of business applications to. So for that, I'm going to click on this link right here that says See All Images. So I click that, and then up at the top, I'm going to click My Items, and then Shared Images right over here on the left, and there is my image definition that I created earlier, and I showed you how to create, and I've stored it in that library, AVD images. So I'm going to select that, and now you'll see that it has my latest version by default, right, listed as the source for the session host. And that's it. I mean, we've now customized our VM, we added our custom software, and now I'm making the host pool based off of that. I mean, that's not quite it. We still got to deploy our apps, but we are pretty far along. How many VMs do you want to make, right? I'll just say 3, but depending on your workload, you have to think about how many users you have, what applications are running, how many you can stack on each VM and still get good performance, all things you're going to have to test out. OS disk type, the rest of this is basic VM building, right? So you should be familiar with choosing your premium SSDs versus your standard, things like that. Virtual networking, you would want to make sure that you picked a network that can connect to your on-premises Active Directory. Depending on how you're doing this, for authentication purposes, they do now support Azure Active Directory. When I first started working with this, it was only on-premise AD, so you had to have a site-to-site VPN or express route or some other way to connect your on-premise Active Directory domain controller, because these virtual machines, these session hosts, are joined to your Active Directory domain, which means you can actually manage them a little bit through group policy and things like that, so it works out really well. Network security group, I'm going to leave it at basic, but you might not assign any to the actual network adapters because you manage that through your networks instead. You don't need to allow any ports, right? This is the great thing about Azure Virtual Desktop. I don't expose these VMs to the internet using RDP or anything like that. We use a secure connection coming in across HTTPS, and then from that gateway, we connect back to those VMs. So it is very, very secure. Domain to join, right? Now you can see they do support Azure Active Directory as well as Active Directory. That's new. You would put an account that has permission to join the machine. Can't type and talk at the same time. To the domain, right? Don't use a domain admin, hopefully. Put in that super secret password for that user. I like to specify a domain or unit. So within my Active Directory, I have a session host OU and then a different OU nested within that for each one of my customers or what have you. So I can apply policy and things like that and manage those machines. So I choose to put the OU equals, right, that distinguished name for that OU, the full path to that in the Active Directory, and then give a local administrator account. I'm not going to fill this out because we're not actually going to finish this. Then you get to workspaces. Now, it's an important concept here to understand with Azure Virtual Desktop. The workspace is what the users connect to. This is what gets published. This is where they see the applications that they've been given access to. So you must have, and thank you LastPass, but not now. You must have a workspace in order for them to connect to it. If you go through all this and don't create one, you can't use it until you go back and create it. And you can do it after the fact. But typically, we're going to do this during the creation. So I'll create a brand new workspace. I can click Create New, give it a name, Demo Workspace or something like that, and click OK. And by default, there'll be one application group created that provides access to the full desktop. And I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second. Then we get into the advanced, and we're looking at like things like diagnostic settings. We have our tags that Adam loves to use, and then review and create, and you're good to go, right? So really, the biggest challenge there is being able to store that image someplace that you can get to through this wizard, and that's using that Azure Compute Galleries, and then making sure you can join the domain. That's the biggest errors I see. Most errors that occur are because they're unable to get those VMs to talk to the domain controller, and they can't join the domain, and the whole process kind of stops right there. All right, Adam, so now we have, we would have clicked Review and Create. We would have waited 15 minutes or so for all those VMs to spin up, and then we'd have something like this, a host pool that we created. So let's take a look at what we got and then how we can work with those applications. Remember, this host pool was created from that custom image. So it's got the Microsoft 365 apps as well as our LOB apps, in our case, Google Chrome and Adobe Reader. So within the host pool, I'm going to go over here to the navigation tree, and I'll zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. And I want to look at application groups. Actually, first, let's look at session hosts. Then I'll look at application groups. Session hosts, there you can see that they are joined to the domain. That's the name of my demo domain that we use. I can see things like there's no user sessions currently. I can go into these VMs and I can turn on drain mode. It does look like I might have one disconnected session there. Drain mode, if I was going to do an update or replace this VM with a newer version of that VM, drain mode allows me to make sure no new connections are established, kind of let the old connections or the existing connections wean off, and then I can turn that VM off and I not lose anybody's work. So you can see that drain mode option right there. All right. Let me go back out here. The next thing I want to look at is the application groups. Now, this is how you expose this to your users, right? This is how the users get either the desktop or the applications that we're going to want to use or want to give them access to. You'll see there's two, all right? This one was created by default. This is the default desktop, all right? It's got an application group type desktop, and it was created when I created the host pool itself. So Azure created this for me. You can only have one pool that provides the full desktop, or one application group that provides the full desktop, which makes sense, right? It's just the full desktop. When I go inside and look at that group, all right, I have to worry about, I can see what applications are assigned to it, but in this case, it's the full desktop. So you see it's just called Session Desktop. But right below that is assignments. This is how you give somebody access to that full desktop, to those session hosts. And you can see I've added a group, not a user, because that's a best practice. We can now use our groups to do this. So I've got an AVD/admins group that has been given the assignment to full desktop. So Adam, shall we see what that looks like? I think.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah,
let's
log in.
All right, so I've opened up another tab, and you'll see the URL if I can get there before it changes. rdweb-wvd or rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com/arm, because it is now ARM-based, /webclient/index.html. I know that's a mouthful, but your users bookmark that, or they can actually use a desktop app to connect to this as well. But what's really cool is your users can access Azure Virtual Desktop from anywhere they have an internet access, as long as they have an HTML5 capable browser. I've done this off of an iPad. I shouldn't say that on our show, but you're connecting to that full Windows 10 desktop on a tablet, on a laptop, on your home PC. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and click. There is that session desktop right there. And just like if I was doing RDP, right, I am connecting in. I will have to authenticate. Oops, and I got to remember my password for this account. We'll see. And thank you, LastPass. There you go. I'm connecting into Windows 10. There's a couple of options I can do. I can stretch this out full screen. I can unpin the nav bar. and you'll see that it pretty much looks like, it does look like I'm sitting at a full Windows 10 desktop, and that's because I am, right? I'm connected now to that session host out in Azure, and I have access to everything on this VM, right? All the applications, all File Explorer, whatever the case may be, I have access to the full desktop, all right? Now let's pin that back out and get back out here. If I go back over to the portal, I can go into my Azure Virtual Desktop and my host pool, and I can see those session hosts, all right? Let me get back over here to session hosts, and I'll collapse these up a little bit. Now I can see that connection. Looks like I connected to IT-Ignite-1 session host. All right, so that's the full desktop. Now from an end user, let me go back over here for a second. In that group or in that host pool, I have another, let's get back over there. I've got those application groups. The one I created is called M365, and I published some of those Microsoft apps. So in this case, I published Excel, Word, and PowerPoint. And if I go into there, I'll see that I've got one assignment for that, a security group that I created called AVD Users M365, and I've added a user, AVD User 1, to this group. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go and jump over to a private browser session. All right. And I'm going to go to that same URL, rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com. I'm going to log in as AVD user 1 at IT. Oops, let's spell that right. At itprotv Cannot type and talk at the same time.
The Azure Virtual Desktop experience doesn't remove the need to remember how to type. That is still a requirement when you use this technology.
Doggone it. All right. Let's see. I'll enter in my password here. And that's going to connect me to the workspace. All right. So this is what's been published for this particular user. Notice he doesn't have the full desktop. I've not chosen to give that to him. All I've chosen is that one group with these 3 apps on it. So they can launch Excel. All right. And it's going to connect. They do have to authenticate again. The first time you're authenticating to the portal, so that to the workspace itself. The second time you're authenticating to the VM that you're now connecting to, the session host, to make sure you have connection or permissions to connect to that. They are working on, and they have, I believe at this point, enabled some ways to do single sign-on. They're definitely working on that if they haven't got that ready already. But there you go. I'm in Excel. We're good to go. All right.
I was just going to say that's actually coming. It's coming online as we speak. It's one of the announcements coming out of Ignite.
There we go.
From 2 weeks ago. So.
Yeah, it's always been the buzz. I know they're working on it because everybody hates to sign in. We know our users are going to hate
multiple authentications to the same resource.
No bueno.
So last year.
It is.
But the interesting thing about this, right, as we maybe just catch our breath for a minute, because we've just seen a whole bunch of stuff. But when I think about the use of the app group, right, it kind of sometimes I have to have this conversation with customers because you get a little pushback, right? The reality is, hey, I'm logging into the portal. I'm already using a web browser. You're essentially just assigning me an application. I'm authenticating twice, let's say now maybe once when we get SSO going, and I'm using the app through the web portal. Why don't I just log into Microsoft 365 online directly, right, is what I hear from customers a lot, because I can use Excel through the web. I don't necessarily need to use it through an AVD session, but it's the ability to scale, the ability to use that in multiple ways, but also, as you mentioned, the ability to control, right, through an app group, the security and the settings associated with it, that really I think becomes part of that story people often miss when they do that quick high-level comparison and say, oh, I could just use it through the web. I don't need an app group for that. I really just need to be able to provision full desktops. And we don't want to undervalue that capability of providing single applications through that common workspace, because it does give us a different level of control than having a user log in directly to the Microsoft 365 real estate through a web browser. So Mike, is there anything else we want to cover, go over, maybe take a quick look at as we get ready to wrap up, and maybe take some questions?
I know we're getting a little short on time. Let's create another app group real quick, just so I can show you how easy it is to publish those applications and make them available to the users, which I think is really where some of the power comes in, and let me just jump over here. Sorry. Let me go into application groups, and I'm going to click add. And I'm going to use my resource group. You notice a lot of this is already selected because I've navigated into the host pool. So there's my host pool already selected. Notice desktop is grayed out because I said you can only have one desktop app group, but you can have as many remote app groups as you want. I'm going to call this one just LOB for a line of business. We can get this done real quick. I'm going to switch over to applications, and this is the part that's important, right? So I want to publish Chrome, Google Chrome, or whatever your line of business application is. Click Add Applications. I'm going to use for my source the Start menu, which you can see right there. And then I've got this drop-down list, and anything that's installed on those session hosts that shows up on the Start menu shows up in my list. So there's Adobe Acrobat right there, right? And it pulls all the information from the app, and I simply click Save. And let's go ahead and add Google Chrome. So again, from the Start menu, and I'm going to choose Google Chrome, and I'll click Save. This is how I created the other one, doing Excel and Word and PowerPoint. I simply clicked Add Application and then chose it and published it. For assignments, you can do this after the fact, or you can do it here. I'll go ahead and do it here. And I'll say AV-users LOB. So I'm using my security groups to help me control who has access to these particular application groups. Click Select. I have to choose a workspace to publish it to. So there's already one created, and you can only have one workspace per host group. So I'll click Next. I'm not worried about any advanced tags. Sorry, Adam. Review and create. And I'm simply going to click Create because my validation passed. So that quickly, I was able to come in here, create a brand new remote app group, create my assignment for it, and have this published out. I mean, this should take no more than a couple of minutes at the most because it's really just creating that publication. There we go. It is finished. So now let's see what happens. I'm going to close this session. All right. Actually, let me do it a different way here because I don't want to. There we go. I'm going to go back into RD Web. I'm going to authenticate as that user again. And look, the change is already there. There's the two new applications, Adobe Acrobat and Google Chrome, that we just published. So that easy, right? And I could have those groups already created, that LOB application group, that M365 application group. So when my customer calls me up and says, hey, I just hired a new employee, they need access to this, this, and this, I simply dump them right into the correct security groups, and they've got that access, right? It's that easy to manage those applications through the Azure Portal. So Adam, that's really all I've got. I mean, we've seen how to create the golden image. We've seen how to make sure that's available so that we can create a new session host based off of that. And then we saw that once we created the session host, it's just a matter of publishing the applications. We can do the full desktop. We can do application or remote apps, what they call it, the app groups. And we can give them access to it's cumulative, right? That user was in two different groups, the M365 users and the LOB users. And so they get all 5 applications that I've published.
And we didn't get a chance to really talk about some of the bells and whistles out beyond, right, just scaling up and creating the initial infrastructure, the monitoring, the reporting, the ability to track session usage, things like that. Obviously, topics we may be able to get into in another conversation at another time, or you can maybe take a look at them over with Mike and I at IT Pro TV at a later date. But Mike, really great demonstrations, really gave us a good depth and breadth understanding of the real estate, the landscape, and how we scale up, and set us up to maybe take some questions from people that might want to know a little bit more. So let's find out what's going on in our audience. Let's see if we have any questions and maybe talk a bit about some of the things they want to know more about.
Great job, guys. Thanks so much. Most of it over my head, but I haven't owned an MSP in a long time. We do have some questions. Is there a bandwidth recommendation either per user or per VM? In other words, should the VM or VM pool be spec'd as if it were a PC? 8 gigs of memory, 256 STD, is that the same way we spec now?
Yes and no. Like for the network bandwidth, they're going to be connecting across the internet, across the World Wide Web into Azure. So really nothing there. All they're getting is that stream video back from that. As far as the VM sizing goes, that's the important part, right? We have to decide what those workloads are going to be. We can have different host pools with different size VMs based on our needs. So I might have a group of office workers that I want to set up for Azure Virtual Desktop. Their primary use is Excel, Word, email, and some other things. So I can set up a VM that has, a good amount of CPU and RAM, and then figure out what each user and decide how many users can connect to that one VM. If I don't give it much RAM and much CPU, I could limit how many users connect to that. But then I would need more VMs to support more users. I can take a really beefy VM that'll host 20 sessions, right? And so if I only got 30 users, I just need 2 VMs or 3 to support that workload. So the answer, I think, is yes, the size is important, but it's going to be very dependent on what the workload is you're trying to support and how many users, concurrent users, you need per VM.
So
Thanks,
building
great.
on that, because Microsoft actually does give us guidance, right, beyond just this logical thought process about if I scale out versus scale up, and maybe where does that median live, right? So what you want to look for is something called the Azure Virtual Desktop Experience Estimator. This is on the Microsoft Azure website. Just search AVD sizing tool. You'll find it. It's the first link typically that comes up. It's a website that gives you the overview Mike was just sharing with you about the thought process, but it allows you to estimate round trip connection time. So we're talking about what we call RTT in the language of Azure Virtual Desktop. You're thinking of it as latency to connect, right? But it also allows us to look at the scalability guidelines around virtual machine sizing. And there's a link specifically there, which will get you deeper into the conversation Mike was suggesting you want to start framing and thinking about. And there's a lot of really good guidance Microsoft gives you up front to allow you to estimate, so you're not guessing, right? Because the downside here that Mike was pointing at is, I think I need this amount of resources, but I'm not sure. And if we under provision, user experience suffers. If we over provision, we're paying for resources we're not using. And I spend a lot of time optimizing these environments with customers, and the sizing guidelines are really going to help you hit that middle of the road mark, that median you want to start from. Remember, you can always add more. It's typically less painful than having to take away things that you're paying for and not using. So keep that in mind.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Mike. So I listen to all of this and I go, wow, no real infrastructure, all virtual for support, hardware independent, some more granular security offerings available. Are there any downsides to moving over to Azure? Remember, you guys don't work for Microsoft, so it's okay.
Adam, you want to start?
Not most days. So, when you think about, I'll just jump in on the security side anyway, and I know Mike's going to have some thoughts, very broad as well. I think, and I pointed out one of these potential pushbacks I get with customers a lot when Mike was walking us through the demo about the app group, right? And the initialization of that space. And hey, I'm providing Microsoft 365 through the app group. Well, why am I spinning up all this infrastructure if I can just do this directly through Microsoft 365, right? I'm already paying. In other words, why am I paying twice for the same thing? I think it's about the stories we tell and the business requirements we identify and how we link those two when I talk to customers that help them to see value. And I think we have to be honest, right? You have to identify the potential weaknesses, the vulnerabilities that may exist, but then you have to understand how to address them and mitigate them and link them to business requirements that are important. The good news about this service is it's essentially the majority of the areas where we would have issues are managed on our behalf. We don't have to worry about physically maintaining infrastructure, about patch managing the capabilities associated, right, with that infrastructure and updating it over time. We really just have to focus, as Mike suggested, on the image and the value add of provisioning those applications and the logical things like making sure single sign-on is working, we're good with our security groups, all the things you recommended we really pay attention to. I think the potential liability is more about us over-provisioning and underutilizing the infrastructure we're seeking to deploy and pay for than it is necessarily about the security aspects that we traditionally are concerned about. Mike, what do you think about that? Are there any other things we should be thinking about as well?
I'm a big proponent of this, and I can't think of too many downsides to it. It's just easier for IT. It's dynamic, right? From the budget side, it shifts things from this capital expenditure of buying everybody a laptop that we know is going to be out of date in 2 years to everybody's got their own device that we can run this on. All they need is a connection to the web and a connection into Azure, and they can have this managed work environment that I control, that I update, that I put the applications on, that I support without having to manage the underlying hardware. And so I think it's fantastic. And we haven't even touched on, maybe another day we can talk about Windows 365 and how that plays into this whole thing. I think that one of the only drawbacks one of the bigger drawbacks that I see is the requirement for the internet access, right? If I have a user that's traveling, that's going in places where there is no connectivity, which I know is few and far between. Sometimes it's hard to imagine places where there's no internet connection, but it happens, right? We get to places where it is slower, where there is no connectivity, and that can be an issue because without connectivity to Azure, you don't have connectivity to your desktop. Hard to be a productive user, right? At that point, so that's probably the biggest limitation is just the connectivity issue.
Yep. We do have more questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so we need to close it up. But this was fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. I'm sure it helped the audience. I'm sure there's a lot more information out there on IT Pro TV, on Azure, and different courses we can take. We do want to share, I said at the beginning that there was an offering from IT Pro TV, and that's an offering to our members, but they've extended it to all attendees of this, and that is you do receive a 10% discount off of your IT Pro subscription just by mentioning that you're on this session or a member of MSP-Ignite. So with that, thank you all for your time today. Hopefully this information you received was actionable and helpful. For those not already participating in one of our peer groups, please reach out to us so we can discuss the value along with our money back guarantee. Mike, Adam, thank you very much for your time and expertise. I look forward to doing this again.
Me too.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.